As discussed in the previous lecture, Theodosius I divided the Roman Empire between his sons. Arcadius became the emperor of the East, ruling from Constantinople, which was called the New Rome, and Honorius became the emperor of the West, and he eventually moved the western capital to Ravenna. Now, the division of the empire did become permanent after this. The centralized government soon fell apart in the West, and the Eastern Roman Empire remained a cultural and political entity for almost another millennium more, till 1543. Historians refer to the Eastern Empire as Byzantium, using Constantinople's original name. Byzantine is a term used to identify whatever pertains to Byzantium. Now, we have to remember these are the terms that the historians use, because those living at the time still considered themselves Romans. The emperors called the empire Rome, and they called themselves Romans. They did speak Greek. Now, Byzantium was the Christian buffer against the expansion of Islam into Central and Northern Europe throughout the Middle Ages. After its fall in 1453, it brought Byzantine scholars back to the West and reintroduced the study of classical Greek to Italy, and that's what helps inspires the Renaissance. Now, art historians divided the history of Byzantine art into three periods. We have the early Byzantine, which is 324, to the onset of iconoclasm, which we'll discuss later. The Middle Byzantine period, which begins with the renunciation of iconoclasm in 843 and ends with the Western Crusaders' occupation of Constantinople in 1204. And then the late Byzantine period is from 1261, when the Byzantines recaptured Constantinople, until its final loss to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. So we'll start with an examination of the early Byzantine art. Now, like previously discussed, imperial art and the luxury arts were both popular during this time. And what we're looking at here, this is the Archangel Michael, and it's early 6th century ivory, and it's 1.5 inches by 5.5 inches. This is one of the largest existing Byzantine ivory panels today. Now again, it shows the Archangel Michael, and the Archangel Michael was the patron saint of the Byzantine emperors. It's inspired by the classical winged Victory, however, we see the winged figure is male. The artist adapted a classical personification, but imbued it with new meaning. It still shows some of the traditions of classical art, but has little concern for rules of naturalistic representation. So if you look at it, Michael is actually much bigger than the architecture that surrounds him. Look at his feet. His feet are on 3 steps all at the same time. The upper body and the wings are in front of the columns, yet the lower body is behind it. And so Byzantine artists rejected the goal of most classical artists of showing three-dimensional works as it was, meaning trying to show the world as it actually is in its dimensionality. Instead, the Byzantine artists focused more on the message and the meaning. Now we're going to move to Emperor Justinian, and we're going to look at Justinianic art and architecture. Justinian ruled from 527 to 565, and this was considered Byzantine's first golden age. The emperors of Byzantium considered themselves the direct successors of the emperors of Old Rome. And Justinian supervised the codification of Roman law into the work Corpus Juris Civis, or the Code of Civil Law. And this became the foundation of the law systems of many modern European nations. Also, he revived the glory of Old Rome in what they called New Rome, which was Constantinople. He claimed Christianity was the empire's only lawful religion, and this was Orthodox Christianity. The central article of faith was the equality of the 3 aspects of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So you didn't have God the Father, which was higher ranking than Jesus or Christ. The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit were all equal parts. And Justinian claimed that anything else besides Orthodox Christianity was heresy. He considered it his first duty to stamp out the few surviving polytheistic cults, but also to crush all of those who professed any Christian doctrine other than Orthodox. And what we're also going to see is Justinianic art was both religious and secular in nature. And we see that in works such as this one. This is the Barberini ivory, mid-6th century, 1 feet, 1.5 inches by 10.5 inches. And again, this is an ivory panel. And in the center, we have an emperor, and many believe this is Justinian. He's riding a rearing horse, and if you look behind him, a barbarian recoils in fear, and we see this dynamic twisting posture of both the horse and the rider. Below the horse, you can see the bountiful earth, and then to his right, a palm-bearing Victory is flying in to crown the emperor. Now, the bottom of the plaque is bearing tribute. We see the barbarians basically bearing tribute and begging for clemency. With them, there is a lion, an elephant, and a tiger. And these are animals that were native to Africa and Asia, which are sites of Justinianic conquest. And all of these were familiar motifs in Roman imperial works. However, what is different is that his power does not come from his earthly armies, but from God. And if you look in the uppermost panel, we see two angels holding aloft a youthful Christ carrying a cross in his left hand. And then Christ with his right hand is blessing Justinian. And so with this right hand, that is indicating approval of the emperor's rule. So again, we see this combination. It has both religious and secular meaning. Now, Justinian was an ambitious builder, and he erected or restored more than 30 churches of the Orthodox faith in Constantinople alone. These works defined the Byzantine style and architecture, and probably none more so than what you're looking at here, and this is the Hagia Sophia. This was Justinian's most important project, and it's the Church of Holy Wisdom. It was designed and built by Athaeus of Tralles, who was a mathematician, and Isidorus of Miletus, who was a physicist. Neither of them were actually trained architects. It was built from 532 to 537. And they did not design the building according to Roman principles. It's 270 feet long and 240 feet wide, and it has a central dome. Now, this dome is 108 feet in diameter, and its crown rises 180 feet above the pavement. And what's interesting is the dome itself appears to be floating, and you can see that in the image here. And what they were able to do with this is they were able to use this through the use of what's called pendentives, and there is an aside in your book. Make sure you do read that. And so basically what it is it's placing the hemispheric dome on a square base. And from that, it transfers the weight from the dome to the piers beneath it rather than to the walls. And so because of this, they were able to have that lower register of the dome be a ring of windows. And it creates the illusion that the dome is actually suspended from the top and not supported by the walls. But again, it goes down into the piers of the pendentives. And so basically what this is a domed basilica. Now, there are several of the external aspects have been added to what we see today. You can see here the huge buttresses on the left side. I think you can see them in this image. Those were added later. And then after the Ottoman conquest in 1453, Hagia Sophia became a mosque, and the Turks added the 4 towering minarets at the corner. So you can see those 4 towering. Those were added later. Now, the exterior used brick instead of concrete, again furthering separating it from Roman design. And it had a very plain exterior, and this became a characterization of the Byzantine design also. And now going back inside, the interior features that distinguish it from other buildings is its mystical quality of light that floods the interior. And this largely comes from those 40 windows that ring the base of the dome. They form a halo of light, and it makes it appear as if the dome is floating. And one person actually observed that it looked as if it was suspended by a golden chain from heaven. The nave was reserved for the clergy only, and the congregation was divided by sex, meaning men would view the rites from the aisles and the women from the galleries. Only the emperor was a lay person who was privileged to enter the sanctuary, and there he would actually take part of the liturgy, standing at the pulpit under the great dome. So this made his rule again sanctified and his person exalted. So only the emperor, right, the ruler could be there, yet he's there literally taking part of the religious rites. So again, making this combination of church and state symbolically one. So the church was the earthly image of the court of heaven, and its light the image of God and God's holy wisdom. Now we're going to move to Ravenna. And during Justinian's reign, Ravenna enjoyed great prosperity. Its culture became an extension of Constantinople, and its art reveals the transition from early Christian to the Byzantine. And we see that in San Vitale. This is Ravenna's greatest shrine. It's not a basilica. It is centrally planned. It features a dome-covered, clerestory-lit central space defined by piers alternating with curved, columned excrade, creating an 8-leaf plan. And so you can see from the exterior here, right, it's a little different than some of the ones we've looked at before. The construction began in 526, and it was paid for by Julianus Argentarius, who was known as Julian the Banker. So we can assume where he got his money. Now, what's interesting is in the interior, mosaics were regarded as one of the greatest achievements of Byzantine art. The images and symbols cover the entire interior of the sanctuary and express the idea of Christ's redemption of humanity in the reenactment of the Eucharist. Now, when we look at the mosaics, though, all the figures are flat, and the clothes just seem to hang off of them. You can see it more here. And there's really no appearance of bodies underneath, and almost all the figures are also fully frontal facing. Now, there is another theme with these, and that's the holy ratification of Emperor Justinian's right to rule. The mural program underscores the dual political and religious role of the Byzantium emperor. On the aspa, which you can see on the right image here, it was shown the second coming of Christ, with Christ sitting on top of the orb of the world. And on the choir wall in the left asp was the mosaic that you see in the left here. And that shows Justinian. Now, both Justinian and Christ wear purple and are wearing halos. Justinian has 12 attendants that accompany him, paralleling Christ's 12 apostles. Next to Justinian on the right is Bishop Maximinus, who was responsible for San Vitale's completion. And he is also the only figure who is labeled. You can see that in the top right there. There are 3 groups of men in this. You see the emperor and his staff, the clergy, and the imperial guard. The imperial guard are on the left, and you can see the guard carry a shield with the monogram of Christ on it. Now, Justinian carries the golden paten, which holds the Eucharist bread. Nothing is placed in the background, showing the procession takes place in this place. So the emperor appears forever as a participant in the sacred rites and as the proprietor of the church. What we see here is, again, the laws of the church and the laws of the state are united in the laws of God and manifest themselves in the person of the emperor. Now, we also see the empress taking a place here, and you see that in the right image. This is the mosaic to Theodora, Justinian's wife. Here we see Theodora and her attendants, but you can see in here they have a background. And so they are placed in space, and it's believed they are perhaps at San Vitale, and they're waiting to follow Justinian in the procession. And so this shows her rank is not as high as his. She was 15 years younger than him, but she became his most trusted advisor. One individual actually described her as, quote, the most intelligent of all and of all times. Artists here highlighted her elevated rank by decorating the border of her garment with a representation of the three magi. So again, you see her here with the link to the religion also. Now, an interesting fact is that neither Justinian nor Theodora ever visited San Vitale. Another example of these great mural or mosaics is at Santa Apollinare in Classe. Classe is Ravenna's port, and this church is built in the early Christian style. It's a basilica with a nave and flanking sides. The exterior is plain, but the interior is decorated with mosaics, and it was dedicated in 549. And what we're looking at is we are looking at the mosaic in the semi-dome of above the apse. You see the large medallion containing a cross, and right above it, if you look up, you can actually see it's a little white hand, and that's the hand of God. On either side of the medallion are Moses and Elijah, who are Old Testament prophets. Below them, there are 3 sheep, which symbolize the disciples John, Peter, and James. Then we see standing there the church's patron saint, Saint Apollinaris, and you can see him. He's standing there with the classical, his arms outstretched in prayer. And with him on the same level are 12 sheep. Now, these could represent the Christian congregation. But what's interesting in this is right below it, right, we see the altar where the bishop would stand. And so literally, this shows the hierarchy to the congregation, right? We have God at the top, the symbols of Christ and his disciples, Apollinaris and his flock, the presiding altar, the living bishop, and then the people. And so you literally can see, what this ascension and this hierarchy is. Now again, the artist did not try to represent voluminous figures in a naturalistic setting. They are flat symbols lined up side by side. Here we've seen the shapes have lost their volume that we saw in earlier mosaic works. They are now flat silhouettes with linear details. And again, it's showing the importance was the message, not a realistic representation. And this became the style for conveying the extremely complex symbolism of the fully developed Christian dogma. And we see this again in another mosaic at Mount Sinai. Now, this was a monastery. A monastery is an enclosed compound for monks, and this is the monastery at Mount Sinai in Egypt. This was also an important pilgrimage site. Mount Sinai is where God gave Moses the 10 Commandments, and the monastery is located at the foot of the mountain, and it's supposed to be the location where God first spoke to Moses as the burning bush. Justinian rebuilt the monastery between 548 and 565 and also built imposing walls around it for protection of the monks and the many pilgrims who traveled here. And so the mosaic that we are looking at here is the mosaic in the asp, and it's the transfiguration. We see Jesus in the center, Moses is below him, and then surrounding them we have the disciples John, Peter, James, and Elijah. Jesus is shown in the deep blue mandorla, which is this almond-shaped aureole of light, and here we can see it's that dark blue. Again, this is in that gold background, so taking it out of time and space, and without distracting, landscape details, that makes it so we focus just on the message and the meaning. Now, manuscript painting was an important art form during the early Byzantine era also. And the example shown on the left is from the Rabula Gospels. This dates to 586 and has full-page paintings of the life of Jesus. And what we see here is the Ascension, where Jesus is going to heaven. But what's so interesting in this painting is that it also shows the important role of the Virgin as the Mother of God. And so if you look at the image, you see Jesus in the mandorla, the blue rising to heaven, and directly below him is the Virgin Mary. And so again, this shows her importance in the religion. Now, icon painting is going to become very important for the Byzantium Empire. Icons literally mean images in Greek, and icons were small portable paintings depicting Christ, the Virgin, and other saints or some combination of them. From the 6th century on, they became enormously popular in Byzantine worship, both private and public. And icons figured predominantly in private devotion, meaning you would, pray to the icon. Unfortunately, very few survive. The example that you're looking at on the right is from Mount Sinai, and again we see the enthroned Mary. This is encaustic, which is the pigment in hot wax on wood, and you can see the Greco-Roman influence with the personalized features of Mary. However, again, the bodies are in that Byzantine, very flat style. Now, what's interesting with icons is some did not believe in this practice, and they saw it as violating the second commandment. Now, this belief became increasingly so in the 8th century when the faithful began to kneel before an icon and pray to it. So icons became identified with the personages represented. And icon veneration became confused with idol worship, which was not allowed by the second commandment. And what, in fact, Emperor Leo III, who reigned from 717 to 741, the Byzantines at that time faced attack from the Caesarians and then from the Arabs. The Byzantine Empire lost almost 2/3 of its territory and much of its population, wealth, and material resources. Now, Leo believed this may have been God punishing them for the idolatrous worship of idols. And so he put out an imperial ban on not only just making them, but of their existence and of all making any sacred images. And he did this in 726. So you couldn't make any icons, and you couldn't paint or do anything to show any of the religious or the sacred images. And so that's where we're going to get some different terms. And this is what's called, is actually led then to iconoclasm. So iconoclasm is where they destroy existing images. The iconoclasts were the people, they were called the breakers of images. So not only do we have where we cannot make any more of the works, iconoclasm, the people are going around and destroying works that did exist. And that's why so many have been lost. Now, you do also have the iconophiles at this time, and these literally mean lovers of images. So these were people who were trying to keep the icons. But for more than a century, the portrayal of secular images and art stopped, but many early works were destroyed. Again, many of the early works were destroyed by the iconoclasts. So these religious images, we don't see them for over 100 years being created because of this belief that it was worshiping an idol. Now that's going to move us into the middle Byzantine art. So in the late 8th and 9th century, we saw a reaction against iconoclasm. And what happens is St. John of Damascus, who his dates are circa 675 to circa 749, is St. John of Damascus claimed God had made an image of himself and technically of all humans in Jesus. And so although icons were images of holy figures, they were not identical to their prototypes. They were doing the same thing that God had done, right? God made himself in the image of man. Icons are making themselves in the image of the holy people, but they're not exactly the same. And so what St. John of Damascus argued, he said, to oppose making images of holy figures was then contrary to the actions of God. If you're saying you can't do this, well, that's kind of like saying God can't do this. Well, God, according to the faith, right, he's infallible, that he cannot make any mistakes. And so because of this, humans have made an error by saying you cannot create the images. And so because of this, we start to see this rejection of iconoclasm. Empress Irene in 780 led a movement to restore image making. And then eventually Empress Theodora, different Theodora, her husband was the Emperor Theophilos, who reigned from 829 to 842. And Empress Theodora in 843 restored image making permanently and led to a condemnation of iconoclasm as heresy. So now it was if you were destroying the images, now you were committing heresy. We also see in the Middle Byzantine era that we have a new dynasty of emperors, and this was the Macedonian dynasty. And they resuscitated the early Byzantine tradition of lavish imperial patronage of religious arts and architecture, and making the images of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints. They also claimed that the only true Roman ruler was in the west at Constantinople, because that's where Constantine had moved it. Now, architecture and mosaics, what we are looking at here, this is what's called the Theotokos, and that is understanding it's the term for knowing that Mary is the mother of God, that she's the mother of Jesus, of Christ. And we actually see this. This is in the Hagia Sophia, but it's dated 867. This was a new mosaic that was in the apse of Hagia Sophia, and it shows Mary and the baby Jesus. Now, you can't really tell here, but she is a much larger figure. She's actually, even though she's sitting down, she's still over 16 feet tall. Now, this 9th century mosaic and other ones mirror the earlier Byzantine works. They're flat, they're frontal facing with the gold backgrounds. However, if you look here, we see a little bit of return to dimensionality. If you look, the throne and the footstool are placed at an angle showing some depth that's much more Greco-Roman or classical in style. And this existence, right, the very existence of this shows the end of iconoclasm in the Byzantine style. Now, in the 10th through the 12th century, we saw new churches being built. These were usually much smaller. They were smaller and they were designed with variations of the domed central plan. The exterior wall surfaces were now going to begin to see some decoration on them. And they were decorated with vivid patterns, probably reflecting Islamic architecture. And what we're looking at here on the left, the church design here is at Hagia Sophia, and this is in Greece. And it shows the design during the Second Golden Age of Byzantine art. You see light stones framed by dark red brick, the windows, projecting apse, and varying roof lines. And then you can see the dome, and the dome is over an octagon inscribed within a square. You also see this type of building in the image on the right, and this is at Daphne. And this is a monastic church of dormition, meaning for sleeping. This was constructed in the late 19th century at Daphne, Greece, which is west of Athens. Its high and narrow design forces the viewer's gaze to rise and revolve. And so actually what we are looking at in the right image is we're inside underneath the dome, looking up at the dome. Now, Middle Byzantine architects aim for the creation of complex interior spaces with dramatically shifting perspectives. So again, here we're looking up at the image on the dome, and this is what's known as Christ as the Pantocrator, meaning literally the ruler of all in Greek, and we see him looking down at us. This theme was a common one in churches in the Byzantine Empire. But what we see here, what's different than the early Byzantine art, is here we see a subtle blend of naturalistic style of late antiquity and the more abstract and formal Byzantine style. Now, with the marriage of Anna, who was the sister of Emperor Basil II, he reigned from 976 to 1025. Anna was married to the Russian Prince Vladimir, who reigned 980 to 1015. They were married in 989, and this actually marked the introduction to Orthodox Christianity to Russia. And so you'll begin to see some of that influence in Russian work. Now, after the fall of Ravenna to the Lombards in 751, Venice in Italy actually became an independent power, and it was run by the doges or dukes. And it became a crucial link between Byzantium and the West. And we see the richness of Venice in the church here, and this is San Marco. So Venice obtained the relics of St. Mark from Alexandria, Egypt in 829. There had been different San Marcos, but the one that we have that remains, this one was started in 1063. Now it's a cruciform plan with a central dome over the crossing and then 4 other domes over the 4 equal arms of the Greek cross. And then the interior, as you can see here, was filled with lavish furnishings, and every single surface was covered with mosaic. The interior is Byzantine in effect. All 5 domes have a ring of windows at their bases, which you can see in 2 of them here. And over 40,000 square feet of mosaics cover all the walls, arches, domes, and vaults. Most of the mosaics date to the 12th and 13th century, and they all show some sort of different biblical scene. Now, what's also interesting is the mosaics have explanatory labels in both Greek and Latin. And again, this reflects Venice's position as the key link between Eastern and Western Christendom in the later Middle Ages. Now, still popular during this time are ivory carving and painting. The Middle Byzantine produced many costly ivory pieces, but what's interesting, instead of just the panels or the diptychs, meaning 2 pieces that we saw before, triptychs, meaning 3, replace the diptychs as the standard for the works. And you can see that on the image on the left here. And this is the Harborville diptych, circa 950, and again, it's made of ivory. Now, this was a portable shrine with hinged wings used for private devotion. And so you can see what we're looking at is it's actually open. So you could take the 2 sides and close it, and there would be decoration on the front and the back. Now, this was, again, a portable shrine, meaning you could take it with you, and it was used for private prayer. This became popular, and often these would replace icons for use in personal prayer. And we can see here again a more of this change from the early Byzantine. If you look at the figures, they're much more fluid in style. They're not quite in contrapposto, but they have much looser stances. And the 3/4 view, we see 3/4 of the view of many of their heads, meaning their heads are turned a little bit, again seeming much more natural. And this more natural classical spirit was an important stylistic current of the Middle Byzantine period. The classical style also emerged in mural painting and book illustration, which you see here. The bottom is a mural lamentation. This is from Nurarzi, which was in a church in 1164, Church of St. Palatomen, which was built in Macedonia. And here we're looking at a mural painting. The mural painting is called Lamentation, and it's an image of passionate grief over the dead Christ. You can see here his followers. You can see their anguish. You can feel their pain. We see their attitudes, expressions, and gestures of human sadness. In fact, if you look at the fallen Christ's body, Mary literally is pressing her cheek against his. And this intensifies the emotional impact on the viewer. Also, it's set in a more naturalistic landscape, not the gold background that took us out of time and space. And again, the reason why it's this more naturalistic landscape is it makes it more real. And then therefore, the idea is that it makes it more emotional for the viewer. Now, remember this one because we are actually going to see this work actually heavily influences another artwork that we're going to look in chapter 14. Again, manuscript illumination was very popular, and that's what we're going to see in the image on the right. This is the Paris Psalter, circa 950 to 970, and it's a page from the Psalms of David. Again, it reasserts the artistic values of the Greco-Roman past. The 10th century, there was considered in Macedonia, it was considered the Macedonian Renaissance, and what we saw was a desire to study the art, architecture, and language of ancient Greece. And so because of that, again, the artworks had more of a Greco-Roman influence in them. What's interesting is this definitely does have a blend of more classical ideas, but also even personalization or allegorical figures that were used in ancient Greece and Rome. So what we see here is we see David as the central figure who is playing a harp. However, again, these allegorical figures are there. Melody looks over his shoulder. Echo, you can see him in the right, peeks from behind a column. And then we see a reclining male figure who's pointing to an inscription that claims him as a representation of the mountain of Bethlehem. And so these allegorical figures never appear anywhere in the Bible, but they're used to help tell the story of the Psalm of David. All right, now we're going to move into late Byzantine art. And so what happens is the Comnenians succeeded the Macedonians in the late 11th century. However, there were three events that changed Byzantium's fortunes for the worst. First, the Seljuk Turks conquered most of Anatolia. Second, the Byzantine Orthodox Church broke with the Church of Rome. And third, their crusades brought Latins, and Latins is just referring to people from the West. The crusades brought Latins into the Byzantine lands. And because of this, eventually in the crusades of 1203 and 1204, they diverted their plan and they actually attacked Constantinople. They sacked the city and took many of the portable treasures back to the west. And we saw those such as at San Marco. Then the Latins then set up kingdoms within Byzantium. Byzantium, what remained, split into three small states. The Pelagians ruled the kingdom of Nicaea for a time. However, over the next 2 centuries, these small states disintegrated, and eventually in 1453, the Ottoman Turks took Constantinople and brought an end to Byzantium. However, we will see even during this time of decline, its art did flourish well into the 15th century. And we can see this in the mural and icon painting. Again, as we've gone from early to mid, now to late Byzantium art, we see a continued influence of the Greco-Roman. You can see this on the left. This is Christ and Cora. This is a fresco in the apse of the Church of Christ and Cora in Constantinople. Here we see the antesis, which is Greek for resurrection, and it's circa 310 to 320. Now, the themes of human mortality and redemption by Christ and the intercession of the Virgin Mary were all in these different murals. What we see here, though, is we see Christ as the central figure, and he's trampling Satan in the locks and keys of his prison house of hell. And you see him raising the two figures, one on the left and one from the right, from their tombs. And who these are, this is actually Adam and Eve. And so we see here Christ resurrecting them, right? Bringing them out of hell and going to bring them up to heaven. Now the action is dramatic. The gestures and the movements are forceful. We have a dark blue background, not the gold. However, it's not completely realistic. So for example, the figures cast no shadows. Now the clothing, though, is also much more fluid, and it drapes like the Greco-Roman tradition. Also during this time, we still have icons, and you see that in the image on the right. This is Christ as Savior of souls, and it's an icon from the Saint Clement Church in Ohrid, Macedonia. This is an early 14th century work. It is tempera, linen, and silver on wood, and it's 3 feet and 1/4 inches by 2 feet and 2.5 inches. And again, here we see this blending of style. If you look, Christ's head and neck are fully modeled and much more natural looking, again with that classical or Greco-Roman influence. However, if you look at the linear folds on the garment, these follow the Byzantine, right? It's much flatter, and those lines, right, the linear lines, that's redundant, the linear folds don't really go with the clothing. It's almost as if they are placed on top. And so again, that's the Byzantine style. And so we're still seeing this influence of both, but we're seeing the works become more and more Greco-Roman. Now, later Byzantine icons also often have works on both sides. So you'll see some of them will say front and back. And the reason why these late Byzantine icons had works on both sides is they were often be carried in a procession, and that way you wouldn't see like a blank back of a work. You would have 2 images. And then they would often be placed on a stand, and these stands were so you could still see most of the images on both sides. Now, with the fall of Constantinople in 1453, Russia became Byzantium's self-appointed heir. Basically, they said it was their role to defend Christianity against the infidel, and this would be done in the court of the Tsar. And the term Tsar is actually taken from the term Caesar. They claimed they were the third and final Rome. That old Rome, new Rome, which was Constantinople, and third Rome, Russia, right? So those three Romes actually spanned over 2.5 millennia and produced some of the most significant works of art in the history of art.